You're listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute, a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and education institute making law work for people, places, and the planet. If you enjoy the podcast and want to support our work, consider donating at eli.org/donate.
Welcome to People, Places, Planet. I'm your guest host, Linda Bregan. I am a senior attorney with the Environmental Law Institute and director of our Center for State and Local Governance. Today, we have a special edition produced in collaboration with the Environmental Council of the States. ELI has worked for decades on building the capacity of state and local governments to address a whole range of environmental issues, as well as to provide resources to state and local businesses, NGOs, and community stakeholders. And over the years, the Environmental Council of the States, or ECOS, as we refer to it, has been a trusted advisor, collaborator, and participant in many of our state centers projects. And as you're going to learn more from its executive director momentarily, ECOS is a nonprofit, nonpartisan association of state and territorial environmental agency leaders. ECOS is a key player in the environmental governance landscape, and we're just delighted to collaborate with them on this and future podcasts. So I want to start by introducing Ben Grumbles, ECOS's executive director, and he is going to be talking with the current ECOS president, Elizabeth Beiser, who is the secretary of the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. Few words about Ben, because he really has played a leadership role in numerous organizations and agencies over the course of his career. He has been the ECOS executive director since June 2022, and he's also served as an officer and active member of the association for almost a decade. But prior to ECOS, he was Secretary of the Environment for Maryland and also the Assistant Administrator for Water at US EPA. And that is just a small sampling of his resume. I should add that he currently serves on ELI's Advisory Committee for the Environmental Protection Agency's Local Government Environmental Assistance Network and devotes his time and expertise to many other ELI projects and convenings as well. And as I said, Ben will be talking today with Secretary Beiser. Elizabeth Beiser has been the Secretary of the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality since June of 2021. Her previous roles prior to leading the department included President of Beiser Strategies, LLC. She also was Senior Policy Advisor and VP of Policy and Public Affairs for the Recycling Partnership. And Ben, I'm going to hand it over to you now. We're really looking forward to hearing your discussion with Secretary Beiser, and I'm hoping you'll start off by just telling our listeners a little bit more about ECOS.
ECOS is the Environmental Council of the States. It is a national, nonpartisan, nonprofit association of all of the state's top environmental leaders. It's been around for about 30 years, based in Washington, D.C., but our members are the 50 environmental secretaries, plus the secretaries of the environment for the District of Columbia and territories. And we're focused on sharing, learning, lessons, peer collaboration among all of the members and their agencies. We're also focused on advocacy. When the organization was created 30 years ago, it was to make sure that the federal government does not lose sight of the needs and the roles, the values of the state environmental agencies. We are governed by having officers who are elected by the members, and we have various committees, but we're very focused on working closely with the federal government, executive branch, and with Congress. I am very pleased to have with me the president of ECOS and also the secretary of the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, Elizabeth Beiser. Secretary Beiser, great for you to be with us and join us here for this podcast.
So glad to be here.
So as ECOS president, you have some specific priorities this year. They're resonating with all 50 of the states and the territories. What's a top priority?
One of our top priorities is really focused on building state capacity. You know, states implement over 90% of the nation's key environmental programs, and that's something that a lot of folks forget about. So we are supported in implementing those programs with federal funding from what's called categorical grants under the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and RCRA, or the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. But that funding has been stagnant for nearly 2 decades, and states rely on this for a good portion of their budgets. Depending on what state you look at, it could be anywhere from 25 to 40% of their budget. And so when that amount of funding has stayed stagnant, it really affects our ability to successfully carry out these programs. We're plagued with a lot of things like vacancies. We've also at the same time had a lot of extra responsibilities put upon us. And so it's really key that we get those funding sources up. We also have a big priority in making sure that the clean water and drinking water state revolving funds are fully funded. One of the trends we've seen recently has been the return of congressionally directed spending. And while we are agnostic on whether or not that exists, what we want to make sure is that we're protecting the corpus of the funding. We're seeing this in stories throughout the country. You've seen it with Jackson, Mississippi being one of the most visible examples. We've got aging infrastructure in every single state. A lot of these water systems were put into place many, many decades ago, have far outlived their usefulness. So having a reliable source of funding for the state revolving funds is critical to ensure that we can keep up as a country with the increasing water infrastructure needs that we're seeing. And so we're advocating to Congress and the federal agencies to try to both increase categorical grants and to make sure that we're protecting the corpus of our state revolving fund programs.
Excellent. Emphasizing both the regulatory programs and the infrastructure programs that are national programs run by all the states and are key to protecting public health and the environment, the 2 state revolving fund programs that every state has established. So you've talked about the funding priorities. What's another priority for ECOS, the Environmental Council of the States?
Well, I think next I'll talk about PFAS, which, I know I could probably talk about for far longer than we have time on this podcast. It's an issue that all states are grappling with right now, especially thanks to the recently adopted federal drinking water standards by EPA. I'll just start by saying the science is clear. There are health impacts for PFAS up to and including cancer, and so states are taking this very seriously. Looking at the implications of the drinking water standard, what we're trying to do as states is get our arms around what is the level of contamination, where is it, and how do we help water systems come into compliance. There's only a 5-year horizon to come into compliance, and that may sound like a long time, but when you think about how long it takes to plan out these treatment systems, do construction, bidding out the construction process. There are so many steps that 5 years goes very quickly. We need to ensure that states have the funding that they need to both do those assessments to figure out what the source of contamination is, because one of the key ways to reduce the amount of treatment you have to do is to reduce the source of contamination going into your drinking water supply. But also, how do we help our water utilities come up with the plans that they need to implement treatment systems prior to the beginning of the compliance period in 5 years?
Bring this home a bit. What's happening and what has happened in North Carolina in terms of PFAS?
Well, North Carolina became an early leader on this issue by necessity. We have a PFAS manufacturer in our state. One facility has contaminated at least an 8-county region, essentially all of southeastern North Carolina. And so we've had to do a whole lot of work on the early end to look at private drinking water wells. So we have a consent order with Chemours that provides for testing and filtration for wells that are affected by Chemours-related PFAS contamination. So we got a lot of early experience with how are we assessing what the extent of contamination is, realizing that this is a multimedia issue, that a lot of the contamination we are seeing is actually coming from air, that we are looking at what had happened with the groundwater and affecting sources far downstream. We've seen the costs associated with cleaning up contamination at the drinking water side. One of our utilities that's cleaning up as a result of Chemours-related contamination spent $100 million, another one $50 million. So we know that these aren't cheap. Rates have gone up for residents as much as 40%. So that experience has certainly helped our approach to looking at how we're looking at it as a statewide issue, because we know that PFAS is bigger than one company or one chemical. So we are taking that knowledge, doing whatever we can to help our fellow states so that they can benefit from the early learnings that we've had, and making sure that we continue that process throughout our own state as we're continuing to find new sources of contamination.
And how are you working with your colleagues, the other top environmental regulators in the other states, to make sure Congress is aware of what is happening in the states as Congress debates funding and regulatory issues associated with PFAS?
Well, both me and my colleagues have been testifying before various committees, especially Senate EPW, as they've been grappling with this issue. We certainly have been meeting with our congressional delegations to help them understand this is going to take a whole of government approach. Can't just be states or the federal government or local governments, but it really has to be one of those great examples where local, state, and federal governments come together to figure out how we're going to tackle this issue and how we're going to get the funding necessary so that we don't have the entire cost of compliance for the federal MCLs falling on the backs of ratepayers.
Okay, I just have to jump in here and interject that the challenges associated with PFAS really highlight this important role that ECOS plays in addressing environmental problems, both in sharing lessons learned, such as the experience that you've had in North Carolina and comparing notes and information and resources among states, but also this important role ECOS plays in the federal realm in facilitating joint problem solving and ensuring that states have the resources they need to address pressing problems as they arise, such as PFAS. I just wanted to emphasize that. And now back to you, Ben, to ask your next question.
This is a bit of a sassy question here. What is more challenging right now? Risk communication, the challenge of everything, everywhere, all at once, or risk management and the concern about what you've called the glitter bomb effect of spreading things around, not cleaning them up?
You know, it's hard to pick one of those. I think they're all important. And as state regulators, I don't think we have the luxury of picking one or the other. Certainly, risk communication is very important as more residents are understanding what PFAS are and what their health implications are and the implications for cost for their pocketbooks. We certainly get a lot of public engagement in making sure that we're communicating based in science and data, and making sure that we've got actionable steps for folks to take is really important. And I know that's something that both the states have been working on very hard, also been engaging with EPA. But in terms of the glitter bomb, and we kind of joke that PFAS is kind of like a glitter bomb, that it goes off and it's just kind of hard to ever clean it up from everywhere because it's just so pervasive. But that just drives home the need for funding for assessments to make sure that we're looking at what's going up into the atmosphere. How is that affecting fate and transport and deposition into surface water and groundwater? Looking at sources for discharges into surface water. Another big issue for my colleagues is addressing private drinking water wells. Like, for example, in North Carolina, a quarter of our residents rely on private drinking water wells. We actually recently established a state program to help with the cost of testing and filtration on an income-tested basis to ensure that not being able to afford it doesn't mean that you can't have clean drinking water in our state. But I know a lot of states are grappling with that too. So it's just one of those challenges. We could talk all day about this, Ben. We could talk about the need for destruction and disposal technology, the problem with land application of biosolids. If you aren't controlling what's going into your water treatment plant, then you're discharging PFAS into surface waters, and you're also accumulating it in biosolids, which then get land applied, which has a whole nother set of consequences. It's like a ball of yarn. Whatever string you pull is going to be a lengthy process to unwind.
Right. And thinking of the destruction and disposal challenge of PFAS also reminds me of just the whole holistic management of a challenging material, which leads me to a question about other priorities you might have for ECOS. What's another priority?
Another priority, a slightly less sticky one, is the circular economy. This is an area that really we see our colleagues from across the country come together on. It's an example of how a healthy economy and a healthy environment go hand in hand. You know, my background really is in recycling, and so I will tell you I am not unbiased when it comes to this. Certainly a personal passion of mine. And this includes everything. We've had conversations at previous ECOS conferences about the recycling of end-of-life renewable energy equipment, all the way to food waste. At our latest meeting in Austin, Texas, we heard a couple of great panels on tackling food waste, and a lot of folks don't really think about it. Largest segment of the waste stream going into municipal solid waste landfills, huge contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, but also a humanitarian issue. We've got so many people in the country who are hungry, who are food insecure, and yet we have a whole lot of edible food going into landfills, but there's an infrastructure challenge there. We haven't developed the infrastructure in the same way we have for aluminum cans or plastic bottles to be able to handle it.
Well, I just have to interject here for a minute because, as you probably know, ELI's Center for State and Local Governance has been working to address the food waste problem for years. I mean, it is just incredible that we waste up to 40% of our food in this country, and most of it goes to landfill, as Elizabeth noted. So I just wanted to flag that ELI has developed toolkits and model governance tools for reducing food waste that cover prevention of wasted food, rescue of surplus food, and recycling of food scraps. And while many of these tools are geared toward local governments in the form of executive orders and ordinances, for example, they can and actually have been adapted in the form of model laws that can be enacted by states. In any event, there really are so many reasons to reduce food waste. And I'm wondering, Elizabeth, if you could tell us more about the economic benefits.
I mean, that's the other thing that you see folks getting on board with is it's not only a good thing for the environment, but when it's creating jobs and economic investment in communities, then it's really popular. And we saw that through the beginning phases of the SWIFR grant program, which was from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. This is the largest investment in recycling we've seen from the federal government in a very, very long time, perhaps ever. And what we saw from that first round is states getting funding for capacity building, data collection, looking at waste characterization analysis to help us understand where the waste is coming from and what infrastructure do we currently have to handle it, and the access for folks to be able to actually recycle themselves. And so we are going to need to continue that investment in data and gap analysis, but there's a lot of areas of opportunities here to make a big difference across the country. And this is one of those great environmental success stories that we can build on.
And you've been emphasizing to your 50 colleagues and to members of Congress that food waste reduction and recovery is, pun intended, a low-hanging fruit to advance the economy, for decarbonization, for humanitarian reasons, and there are just tremendous opportunities in collaborating with other agencies beyond the environmental agency on that front. So I want to ask you one other priority that comes to mind for ECOS, a national priority this year.
The last one I'll mention today is workforce development. This is a really big issue. I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation about how with federal funding remaining stagnant, there's a lot of vacancies. We have less funding for salaries. We haven't kept pace with where we need to be given the growing economy. And this is really important for us being able to do our jobs. This is foundational. It's not as sexy of a topic as some of the other things are, but if we don't have people in seats reviewing permits, doing compliance checks, doing the work to drive the circular economy, then we really are nowhere, right? We have to have those people to make our missions operate. And so we are really focused on how do we help one another look at best practices for recruitment and retention. How are we working with our federal partners on creative ways that we can fill these gaps? How can we streamline? I know we're looking at how do we make sure that we're being as efficient as we can with the people that we have. But at a certain point, efficiency only takes you so far. I'll tell you a story from North Carolina back a couple of years ago. We had a vacancy rate as high as 23% as a department. We have fortunately worked to get that down to 14% in the past 2 years, but our vacancy rates for engineers and environmental specialists, who are some of our critical positions for permit reviews, remain stubbornly high. We're talking close to 25%. So that's 1 out of every 4 seats empty, which really leads to backlogs. So it's not good for economic development when the environmental agencies become a backlog on permits, and it's not good for the morale of our employees because then their workloads are unmanageable. So we are seeing states rise to the occasion. I'll tell you, one of the ways that we've addressed this with the engineering vacancy is we created a flexible workforce because our state's handling about $6.5 billion in water infrastructure funding right now, which all has to come back to us for permitting. It boomerangs back to us. So we created a flexible engineering group that goes to where the need is. So we're using data to manage and look at where the permits are coming in and project out where they're going to be. And then we reallocate folks as needed so that we're going to the surge. So kind of like you've heard the saying, don't build the church for Easter Sunday. We've been trying to make sure that we are deploying our resources as efficiently and leanly as possible. Obviously, overstaffing is not going to be an issue for us because we just can't get enough qualified candidates through the door. But I know that the North Carolina example is pretty typical of what I'm hearing from other states as well.
Yeah, other states and their legislatures might say we aren't prepared to grow the size of the state agency. But it's not just about size, it's about technical capacity, smarter, more nimble. How are you working with the intellectual capital in the state, the universities in North Carolina?
We are very blessed in North Carolina to have some fantastic universities in our backyard. And so to give you an example of how we've been partnering, PFAS obviously is a big issue for us. We are fortunate to have some of the leading researchers in the country in our backyard. And so we established a partnership, a fellowship in DEQ, where they are coming in and spending semesters with us. The Policy Collaboratory, which is the policy group that cuts across different university lines, is paying to buy out their course load for the semester so that they can spend that time with us. And what we're finding is that it's not only a benefit to us to know what they're working on and be able to benefit from their latest research, also finding that they're understanding the rulemaking process better, what we need to make sure that we're protecting public health. And in a lot of cases, there were some minor adjustments they can make on their research in terms of how they were doing it that would make it much more useful to us. So it's been a phenomenal partnership and another example of the benefits of collaboration and partnership that we're seeing.
President Beiser, any final thoughts about the role of state environmental agencies in carrying out the nation's environmental laws?
I'll just emphasize one more time that over 90% of the nation's primary environmental laws are implemented and enforced by the states. This means that we need to have sufficient funding. It means that environmental progress is going to require partnerships. And as more responsibilities are being placed on state shoulders, I'll say responsibilities and opportunities, it is important for states to make sure we have the resources and the capacity that we need to collaborate with federal and local and private and non-governmental partners.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks to our friends at ELI for this opportunity.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you, Ben and Elizabeth, for participating in this special People, Places, Planet podcast. It really was so interesting to hear about ECOS's priorities and just gain insights into how states such as North Carolina are approaching some of our most pressing environmental challenges. And as I said at the start, ECOS, and of course its members, play such an important role in the environmental protection landscape today. As director of ELI's Center for State and Local Governance, I'm particularly looking forward to more collaborative podcasts and just learning more about the important work of ECOS and its members. In the meantime, we thank you for listening today and hope you will listen to other People, Places, Planet podcasts soon.
Thanks for listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute. Our work wouldn't be possible without the support of people like you. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, attend one of our events, or support our work financially, head to eli.org.